My name is Hannah D. You can find me at HMD1 ABBA, so if you've got any questions, you find me on the Discord. I've already posted my link to my slides on the Discord channel. So if you wanted to get hold of them there, they're all ready for you to use. I've got a website because I'm a human being this century. And I'm representing Aberystwyth University, good try, and BCS Women. I've forgotten to wear my name badge today, unfortunately. It's in my room, I'll get that later. On my name badge, they've spelled Aberystwyth correctly, but not BCS Women, which I thought was a good try. General outline of the talk. What I'm going to do is start off by telling you what gives me the right to talk to you about this stuff. What gives me what are my credentials to stand up in public and talk to other people about what they should think about diversity, right? I'm just a computer scientist. Well, firstly, I'm a woman, and I have been for a long time. And I'm technical, I've got a PhD in AI. I do robotics, I do computer vision, so I am actually technical. My first degree was cognitive science, and that in Leeds at the time was philosophy, psychology, and computing. So 3 different subjects. And I was an undergraduate in the 90s, and like many undergraduates in the 90s, sometimes I fell asleep in lectures. And if you were to wake up in a lecture, you would immediately know what subject you were in without even opening your eyes because of the gender ratio, right? You could tell the computing about 20% women if you're lucky, philosophy about 50-50, psychology about 20% guys. It was just weird. And from that moment on, I've been kind of interested in why this is the case and how we might begin to think about this as a problem and how we might begin to shift the dial. So I've read a lot. The other real advantage of coming through a cognitive science background is that I'm really happy with discipline hopping. I can read the psychological literature, I can read the philosophical literature, I can read the computing literature. I'm pretty much all right at reading outside of the comfort zone of computer science. But obviously I did specialize in computer science because otherwise I wouldn't have got a PhD in AI, right? That is probably like the biggest specialism you could go for. And what really woke me up to the problem again was my first conference presentation. So the first major AI-based conference presentation I gave was at ACCU 2004 in Prague, in the Czech Republic. And I was talking about video surveillance systems and their evaluation with regard to person tracking and detection. So it's computer vision stuff, right? And I'm in this room in Prague, and there's about 90 people. It's a workshop, it's not main conference streams. There's only about 90 people in the room. And I'm looking up at the ceiling where it's got big ornate carvings of naked ladies and concrete breasts dangling down at me. And I realize at that point, I'm the only woman in the room and I'm on the stage. And I just stopped. I actually literally lost my thread, couldn't say a word. And you're used to being, as a woman in tech, you're used to being the only woman in the room. I was the only woman in the lab of maybe 20 people or something, but that was the first time I'd been the only woman in a room with 90 people with breasts on the ceiling. So it did kind of make me think, what? Actually made you think, what, right? Well, how can this be the case? This stuff is really interesting, it's really challenging, it's gonna change the world. Why are half the population not doing this? Yeah, and maybe 18 months later, I presented at the London Hopper, which is the event for women postgrads and postdocs, which is incidentally where I met Gail, which is probably, some years later, which is probably how I ended up standing here, but that's another aside. Anyway, and at the London Hopper, everyone was a woman apart from one guy, and it was like it had been completely reversed, and it was just a different experience. And I come from a small part of South London where they have single-sex comprehensive schools, so I'm very aware that all-girl environments don't have to be nice places, right? They can be horrible, but women in tech conferences, in my experience, are actually really positive things. So I founded one for women undergraduates, which means I've spoken to lots of women, particularly young women in tech, and tried to give that experience of not being the only woman in the room to a lot of other people, just because being the only woman in the room happens so often and is weird still. So anyway, that's what lets me talk to you about this stuff. I've read a lot and I've spoken to a lot of people, and I've been in this field for a while now. What you're going to get out of this talk, I'm not going to assume that you all know the diversity-related stuff, because one of the things that happens when you're a woman in tech is you have to read a load of stuff to get your head around why this is happening. And I'm very aware that the guys don't find themselves involved in this literature quite often as much. Some of you will, some of you won't. So I'm going to give you an introduction to some concepts that might surprise you. I'm going to have a bit of a rant because it's a keynote and I could do that. And I'm going to finish with some practical suggestions of stuff that you people in tech can do to think about this, right? And I'm going to start off by explaining my title. One of the other things is, so my title is Diversity Is Too Important to Be Left to Women. And this is a direct play on a quote from Karen Spark-Jones, who said, computing is too important to be left to men. And she said that in 2007. It's one of her later interviews. Has anyone heard of Karen Spark-Jones? A couple of people. Anybody worked in search? If you've ever used inverse document frequency, she's the person that came up with that. She's really major contributions to information science and so on. So she's a very big Cambridge computing science person. But yeah, computing is too important to be left to men. Diversity is too important to be left for women. But there are practical and conceptual and political and all sorts of different difficulties when it comes to discussing diversity, right? Because people think about gender differences as being, this bell curve here of the guys, and there's this bell curve here of the girls, and there's big separation. And actually, it's not the case that these gender differences are massive and entrenched. And one of the things you find if you read the psychological literature is that once you control for things like experience or things like upbringing, the gender differences are not that pronounced. Gender is complicated and it is difficult to get your head around, but the differences aren't that great. People are from Earth. It is not the case that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. We are all basically the same species. I don't think that's controversial. But you always find yourself saying things like, well, women are more likely to take on caring roles. Women are more likely to have certain types of experience. Men are more likely to take on technical roles. And it is simultaneously possible for there to be very little evidence of gender differences in the broader community, but also some exceptionally talented guys and some really useless women. These things can all be true. And whenever you say, talk about diversity, someone will say to you, I had a woman boss once, she was great. And to which you nod and smile, or they'll say, I worked with a woman once, she was the best engineer I ever knew. There's no problem with this. Women could do this if they want to. And you end up with a problem of having lots of anecdotes or lots of data. And there's actually a difference between anecdote and data, but it's this kind of arguing from the general to the specific and back again is problematic and difficult to get your head around. So I just wanted to kind of put that up there. Stereotypes are difficult, but stereotypes are also useful. These are the kinds of problems that you have to get your head around when you talk about this stuff a lot. Yeah. Stereotypes are useful, for example, if you're talking about gender differences and you want to put them on a graph. I have in the past tried not using blue and pink because blue and pink are horrible, but actually it just confuses people and it also confuses me, and I forget which one I've used for which, even though it's quite often obvious from the data. So I have used blue and pink in the graphs here. Anyone guess what this graph is? Nope. Keynote speakers for this conference, yeah, well spotted. I went back through the keynotes, and can I just say I'm very, very pleased to be invited. And also, you have had some great keynotes. You have had some fantastic speakers. But these are keynote speakers for this conference going back 20 years, because 2020 was, let's just not talk about 2020, right? We can make an agreement not to talk about 2020 in any respect. So I've gone back 21 years because that's 20 years in actual conference time. And you can see things have changed, yeah? And you can see when they started to change. So that's great. Things are really moving in the right direction in terms of conferences and representation, but diversity is not a solved problem. We've got, this figure is from the Women in Tech book from the BCS, which I am a co-author for, and I have a discount code for, but I'll put that on the Discord, so discounts on the Discord later. But female representation by occupation within tech, this is a 5-year average, so it's quite robust figures. What we can see at the bottom here is all workers, 48%, and tech, I'm going to use 20% as my kind of general figure whilst I'm talking this through in that for the rest of the presentation. Not because 20% is accurate, actually 20% is aspirational, which is horrible to think about, right? Isn't it horrible to think that 20% would be an optimistic estimate? But it differs, that number in universities, so my student body, every student body, people claim, oh, we've got 30% this year, but that usually means they've got an extra 5 students, right? So in universities, you're looking at 17, I think, is the current average. A-level, 1 in 6, I believe, which is close to, but not quite 20%. GCSE is slightly higher, but not hugely. And people talk about a leaky pipeline, but basically what we're looking at is very low numbers. When you've got very low numbers, getting an extra 5 women can change the ratio hugely in an organization, right? So 20% is the number we're looking at. And I would say that is not a solved problem at all. I would say that's quite a big problem. And it's a big problem for women, obviously, because tech jobs are good. I don't know about you, but I like my job most of the time. Not all of the time. I don't know many people like their job all the time. But mostly we do interesting work and it pays relatively well. And we can do work that is useful and changes the world if we want to. You know, we can. The great thing about tech is you can work in any area to a certain extent. Yeah? If you're interested in ecology, you can look at tech for ecology. If you're interested in psychology, you can do systems for psychology. Everything's got computers in it, so we need people who could do computers. I don't need to tell you that, right? I don't need to tell you that. So it's a problem for tech, and it's a problem for women, and it's a problem for guys, because I think, hands up if anybody would like there to be fewer women in tech. Anybody think we're about right? Anybody want more? Yeah, I think that's quite convincing. So it's a problem that we want to look at. And I'm talking about gender, partly because it's one that's been heavily researched, right? So sociologist is my first this is my first diversity-specific term that I'm introducing that you might not have heard of yet. Sex role spillover or gender role spillover is what happens when you've got a real imbalance in roles, gender roles normally, in a profession the profession starts to absorb some of the characteristics of the gender roles as professional roles. And this happens in male-dominated professions, but it also happens in, for example, nursing. So male nurses have a difficult time of it because sex role spillover means that there are aspects of their profession that are feminized that wouldn't need to be if it was equal. So sex role spillover is a problem for tech in general. Gender is one of the easier characteristics to measure, and I'm not meaning that in any complicated way. I'm just meaning that we know that half the population are approximately female. Sorry, approximately half of the population are female, not half the population, approximately. We know what the numbers should be, right? It's easy to say. But if you're looking at age or disability or gender reassignment or marriage, civil partnership, pregnancy, maternity, race, religion, belief, sexual orientation, which are the 9 protected characteristics, the baseline is harder to say, right? So it looks like there are some issues with race, and there are reports on this, but because the baseline is different, if you've only got 10% of people who are black and you've got 10% of your tech population who are black, then that's good. But if it's 9%, it's difficult, more difficult to consider the sum. So it's easier to talk about gender in this way. It's harder to point to norms in other protected characteristics. But we do need to think about these, and we specifically need to think about intersectionality, which is my second big diversity term to talk about. And that is the way that somebody who is, all of us have different intersecting identities, and you might have more than one thing going on. I put class in here as well, because I think that's something that we also need to consider, but it's not a protected characteristic. Okay, so that was kind of how, intro kind of stuff. Now I want to talk about why, and I'm kind of conflating 2 whys here. I'm kind of conflating why you should be bothered, and also why the problem exists, and why gender in particular is problematic with regard to tech and probably with regard to STEM more broadly, science, technology, engineering, maths. There's a kind of space of possible talks I could have given, and there were lots of talks on the business case for diversity, and started with McKinsey in 2007, and it turns out that actually this case is well made in a lot of places, most recently in the Financial Reporting Council stuff, but these studies say if you've got diverse boards, then your companies will perform better, and there will be less shareholder dissent, and you will make better decisions, and there'll be more consensus. And it's generally companies that have diverse boards perform better. And this was first described in depth by McKinsey, as I say, but there's lots of other things. And I remember sitting in a talk next to one of my students once when somebody else was talking about diversity, and they brought up the whole business case for diversity thing, and the student turned to the person next to her and said, is she suggesting we've got magical business ovaries? And that has stuck in my mind ever since as a phrase. It's not the case that there are magical business ovaries. Actually, well, it's just that having diverse opinions feeding into a decision-making process mean better decisions, right? But I'm not a smiling face of corporate feminism here to talk to you about business motivation and stuff like that. I'm just going to sort of skim over this and go on to other stuff. I'm not here to tell the woman in the room to lean in and to take a seat at the table, because I don't think we need to tell the women in the room to do any more, to be honest. That's kind of my point. I'm going to tell the women in the room to lean out, and I'm going to tell the men to lean sideways. Now I'm going to talk about kind of leaving aside business concerns, there are also technological concerns about the systems that tech companies build and the kinds of things that we produce when we have monocultural teams. And monocultural teams in tech usually means white guys, right? But there are other kinds of monocultural teams around. So a lot of the voice assistants have women voices by default, right? And if you look at how people interact with voice assistants, they quite often treat the voice assistant as a slave, basically. You have a little digital slave who does what you want. And it's important that these are seen as subservient, and it's important that they have women's voices because of this. Whether this would have been different if guys had been on the design, more women have been on the design team, I don't know. But it's interesting to consider the way we use these things and the way they're designed. The voice recognition systems on these things quite often don't work as well with female voices. And quite often voice recognition systems work better with deeper voices. Health tracking apps, it was Apple Health, I believe, that enabled you to track your copper intake before it enabled you to track your periods. I don't know, anyone in here track their copper intake? Okay, I could tell you that pretty much all cis women and a lot of trans guys will have been interested in tracking their periods before tracking their copper intake. And the idea that you wouldn't think of having this in your system is just, it's an omission that probably wouldn't have happened if the teams had been more diverse when they were testing it. Face recognition systems have got real problems with black faces in particular, but also other ethnic minorities. And it's because quite often they're trained on internet data sets which are heavily skewed towards the West. The first option for gender on a form is nearly always you choose male or female, not female or male, always. You've got this kind of thing going on. And forms will still insist that gender is binary. And I think having more diverse design teams means tech that is more usable for a wider range of people, right? People build what they want to use. So the decisions that we're making in terms of what we choose to build are skewed by the people that are building it. And the phrase that quite often is used in the computer science education community is we want to get people to be creators and not just consumers. And at the moment, the creator end is heavily skewed towards a particular demographic. And I think we need to start shifting that. This first quote here is something that a friend of mine had say to her face, even though she's a software engineer, last week. So this is fresh. Someone said to a woman software engineer, if you ask a software engineer what version control they use, he'll say Bitbucket. And you just think, you're talking to a woman, right? And I want to apologize for using Here Come the Beards as another quote from this week, but I'm going to say that it's an assumption that if you're an older programmer, then you're going to have a beard. Actually, been working on it, but it's just not happening. This idea of default male, where you assume that things are female, honestly, if you're going to get one thing right, get that right, Hannah. Anyway, assuming that things are male unless otherwise specified has been explored a lot, and Caroline Criado Perez has done a lot of work on this, and if you're not subscribing to her newsletter, it's great, it comes out once a week, and it's funny, and it's angry, and it's good stuff. But she highlights things like research studies that describe I've gone blank. I had an example in my head, but it's gone. Apologies. Anyway, even non-existent faces perceived through pareidolia, I could never say that word, are more likely to be male. So if you see a face in a pepper, and then asked to say if that's a male or a female face, people will say it's a male face. So even if their face is not even human, you'll perceive it as male. Robots almost always perceived as male unless they've got a woman's voice. The idea that male is default is kind of hard-baked into part of our society and has ended up being hard-baked into our own perceptions, right? And I'm going to have a little aside now, which is about the default male, as in people assuming that the people that they work with are going to be male, and ask, does anyone know anything about this image? Anyone know who this is? A couple of people. Yeah, Lena. Okay, so Lena is, Lena Soderbergh was her unmarried name. I've forgotten what her married name is, but she was a Playboy centerfold in 1972, and when they were looking for an image to do some early image processing work on, the postdocs in this lab in LA decided that they would use the porn that one of them had brought to work because that's entirely appropriate. So they scanned the copy of Playboy that this person had brought to the office, and it became a standard image processing image. And I wrote an article on Lena for Software Saved, the software sustainability newsletter, and discovered that on my Linux install, because I do computer vision work and have a lot of libraries, I actually had 6 copies of the image without ever having used it. So she comes for free with all image processing software now. The full image, you can find it online. This is just the crop that is commonly used. It's quite tame by today's standards. But I have walked into a lab and seen a framed copy of it on the wall. So it's appropriate to have framed Playboy images on the wall, uncropped, like the whole thing. And that kind of assumption that it's appropriate to have naked ladies on the wall of a research lab is one that I would like to start challenging more. I think ICIP, International Conference on Image Processing, Montreal, I think, 2015, they had her give out the best paper prize. So they flew the actual woman over to give out a prize because it's appropriate for Playboy centerfolds to give out prizes in computer science conferences this century, apparently. I'm not going to talk about Booth. Has anyone seen a Booth babe recently? Has anyone seen a Booth babe? Hands up if you've seen a Booth babe. Okay, have you seen a Booth babe in the last 10 years? Yeah, a couple, okay. Yeah, they don't exist in the conferences that I go to anymore, but I understand they still exist in other places. The idea that a scantily clad lady would be an appropriate way to try and sell software or technology is not something I've ever got on particularly well with for reasons that are probably obvious. Another potential conference presentation that I might have been able to do is the conference presentation where I just basically show images like this for 45 minutes and rant. But I decided not to follow that particular line. But the idea that this pink it and shrink it thing, where you've got, it kind of follows on from the default male, because you have laptops and then you have ladies' laptops. And you have microscopes and then you have girls' microscopes. The girls' microscope had, I think, half of the resolution of the smallest one of the general microscopes, but was pink. But this kind of encouraging girls to do STEM by producing things in pink is not something that would have ever worked on me. But I can see how it might be useful for some of the more pink-oriented kids. However, making it pink and also useless is something that I think we really have to stand up against. 25 functions, 50 functions. I think this is from Ireland because it's in euros. But so if you look at the research particularly into school kids, and why girls choose to move away from STEM subjects, there's three things that come up again and again. And one of them is sense of belonging, one of them is self-efficacy, and another one is relevance. They don't see it's relevant to them, they don't feel like they're any good at it, and they don't feel like they belong there. And that's a pretty good triple whammy of things that put people off, right? It's not for me, I'm rubbish at it, and it's not relevant. There you go. But the sense of belonging is something that's really hard to work on, right? And this is another show of hands. Women, have you ever been the only woman in the room? Put your hands up if you have. Yeah, okay, I think that's most. Guys, have you ever been the only something in the room? You ever been the only man in the room? Okay. How did it feel? Question. Anyone willing to answer? Uncomfortable. Yeah, uncomfortable. For the first Lovelace colloquium, the head of department that I was working with, where I was working when I hosted it, came and did the introduction, and he bounded into the lecture theatre, as he does, and stood there and then just stopped for a second. This has never happened to me before. And he never professionally had been in that situation before. It's weird. And it's not, you get used to it. It's uncomfortable slightly, but you get used to it. And it's just so nice when it's not the case. Have you ever been told to your face that computing is not for you? A couple of people, yeah. Okay, yeah. And I volunteer at a robotics club for school kids, and actually most of the volunteers are women at this robotics club. And one of the kids said, "Oh yeah, but robotics isn't for girls, that's why they're not here." And the four of us that were helping just looked at each other and went, "Robotics isn't for girls." And that was like 2 years ago. This is still happening, right? Have you ever been told you're a good role model? And that's a kind of positive piece of weirdness, but it's a piece of weirdness nonetheless, right? If you are in a minority, you don't stand for yourself, you stand for all of them to a certain extent. There's an XKCD cartoon. That's another alternative keynote. I could have just done the whole thing through XKCD cartoon. Anyway, there's one which is like, there's a person at a whiteboard and they're doing math. They say, "Gee, you suck at math." And then there's a person at a whiteboard with a ponytail. They say, "Oh, gee, women suck at math." And the idea being that if you're in a minority, then you stand for everyone. These kinds of things are the kinds of things that kind of undermine your sense of belonging in a field, right? And how you get away from this is very difficult, but this is the kind of thing that we need to start considering, right? If people don't perceive themselves as belonging, then they're not going to be motivated to join it, and they're not going to stay when they get there. If you're constantly told computing's not for you, if you're constantly walking into rooms and thinking there's nobody who looks like me here, then it's weird. It's weird. The next kind of piece of psychological literature that I want to talk about briefly, although again this could be a longer section, is the concept of stereotype threat. Has anyone heard of stereotype threat before? Anyone? Really? No, a couple of people, like very few people. Okay, so when people are primed to think of themselves as being part of a group which is associated with a stereotype, then they behave in such a way that conforms to that stereotype. And I think I've said before, stereotypes are useful. They're kind of cognitive shortcut. They kind of help you make decisions quickly. But if you're not aware of them, you can kind of pretend they're not there. But if they're brought to the foreground, then they affect your own behavior. And the way psychologists have done experiments to show this, and this is a really robust effect, like 300 plus studies. This link is a meta-analysis. They've done things like they show videos in the foyer of a psychology experiment which emphasised traditional gender roles, and then the people doing the study go in and do a maths test, and if the video is neutral, girls perform reasonably well, boys perform reasonably well. If the video is reinforcing gender roles, girls perform worse. Girls perform worse in maths tests if they're the only girl in the room and everybody else is a guy, because it's made obvious to them at that point that they don't fit. So the girls don't do maths things at the head of. There are lots of theories as to why this happens. It could be to do with cognitive load associated with combating the stereotype ideas. It could be to do with just being reminded of it. It's been shown that in something as simple as mental rotations, anyone seen mental rotation studies? You get shown a picture of a 3D shape and you have to say whether it's the same or different to another 3D shape. And the time it takes is linearly related to the rotation, pretty much. It's Roger Shepard, 1950, something really standard psychology experiment. So just mentally rotating things. If, as a primer, people are told, this study investigates mental rotation, which is really useful in things such as engineering and spatial reasoning and so on, girls perform worse. If they're told, this study studies mental rotation, which is really useful in embroidery and flower arranging, then girls perform equally. Priming people with things that suggest the task is appropriate to them will make them perform better. And this has been shown to hold not just over gender, and I think it was first shown to hold to do with racial stereotypes, and it's been then shown in other things. So what we've got here is a situation in which when you emphasize the fact that women don't fit in tech, then women perform worse. And the next one I want to talk about is, and this is another one of those psychological things, this is one of those, sometimes psychological results come in the stating the bleeding obvious category, and this is one of them. How effective people think they're going to be at a task influences how they perform. Well done. Someone got a grant to work this out. Anyway, there are gender differences in self-efficacy even when controlling for ability. So there's this study that is linked at the bottom, shows that in physics, and there's no reason to suggest this wouldn't hold in other subjects, guys' self-efficacy levels at grade C equal girls' self-efficacy levels at grade A. So people getting an A think they're quite good at physics if they're girls, and they think they're very good at physics if they're boys. So girls have less self-efficacy in STEM subjects, and that is shown in lots of studies. But higher self-efficacy will lead to better problem solving because you believe that the things that you are doing are right, so you believe that your results are correct, and you're less likely to abandon correct hypotheses if you get setbacks. Self-efficacy level influences choice of task. So if you've got a choice of doing a basic or an intermediate or a difficult problem-solving exercise, if you believe you're good at something, you'll choose the harder tasks and you will take setbacks better. If you believe you're good at something, you will enjoy it more. And it will influence what jobs you apply for and what subjects you go on to study. And I don't think it takes a PhD in psychology to predict some feedback loops here, right? If people do more complicated exercises when they believe they have a better self-efficacy, then they're going to get better at it. And you're going to end up with the kind of self-fulfilling, virtuous circle feedback loop with the obvious unpleasant feedback loops for people with low self-efficacy. So, nearly there, nearly at the end of the why section. So leaving aside the macroaggressions for now, microaggressions the idea of microaggressions makes it seem unimportant. And And when we're talking about microaggressions, we are talking about little things, right? We're talking about the casual suggestions that you don't fit. We're talking about overhearing demeaning remarks. We're talking about being mistaken for someone at a lower level, need to provide more evidence of your competence. Talking to someone, if you're talking to a man and a woman about a subject, assuming that the man is the subject expert, having your contributions ignored, being talked over, mansplaining, all of these things. And these are minor, they're not big things. And you shrug them off, you shrug them off, you shrug them off. You always shrug them off. Have you ever been asked to make the tea? Hands up if you've been asked to make the tea. Yeah, quite a few people. I'm not sure the gender ratio there was exactly as predicted in my head, but yeah. I was once asked to make the tea in a room of men, and I said, I don't know how to use your kettle. And they said, nor do I. And so, how can I win in this situation? You have outwitted me, I said. I had a friend who was CTO, I think, at the time of the V&A Museum. Anyway, she picked up the phone and someone asked if they could be put through to her boss, because obviously the person answering the CTO's phone line had to be the secretary if they were a woman. Weird, yeah? Anyone ever assumed you're in sales? Happens all the time if you're not what people expect from a technical person. Is it inevitable? Are these microaggressions inevitable? Right. And now I'm going to show you an animation, which is why it looks like I've got like 120 slides, but I promise you I haven't. So we've got the blues and the pinks here, right? So the blues are the guys and the pinks are the girls. And we've got our 20% ratio. So 20% of the people are pink. And 20% of them are horrible. So 20% of the guys are sexist to women, and 20% of the women are sexist to guys. This is called the Petri multiplier. And I like this as a thought experiment because it assumes that guys and girls are equally horrible to each other. It doesn't assume anything about privilege, it doesn't assume anything about intersectionality, it doesn't assume anything. It's a really minimal model of microaggression. And what happens is, if 20% of the guys are being horrible to the women and 20% of the women are being horrible to the guys, most of the guys get away with no trouble at all, and most of the women, all of the women, receive quite a lot of abuse. And the reason that happens is it's a mathematical model. It's easy enough to work through. So you've got 20% of women, so your gender ratio is 1 to 4, 4 times as many men, making 4 times as many microaggressions at the women. There are also 4 times fewer women, so each woman is 4 times as likely to receive a remark than each man. So women get 16 times the number of microaggressions. And that all this assumes is there's a gender imbalance and people are nasty. Some people are nasty. That's all it assumes. And it holds. People have done Monte Carlo simulations of this. People have modeled it in different ways. They've made different assumptions. But broadly speaking, if you've got a gender ratio of 1 to R, the smaller gender will receive R squared as many microaggressions as the larger gender. So this is, you can see it here in the thing. So this woman here has received 6 targeted, but a load of the guys getting none. And I like this, it's simple. It's a model, so obviously all models leave some stuff out, and all models are simplifications. We're computer scientists, we know how to do, we know what modeling involves, right? But the things it leaves out are things that probably would make the situation worse, right? So this is like a minimal model which shows that this, just having the imbalance is problematic. And the other thing that we need to consider is that there are some they call this the diversity tax. There are things that women in tech do because they're a minority in tech, like speaking at conferences about diversity, like sitting on panels, not just panels about diversity, but also interview panels. We've got a policy at work which says that every interview panel must have at least one woman on it, so people being interviewed don't see an all-male panel, which is fair enough until you realise how many panels we have to sit on as women, right? There is a tax, there's a knock-on effect of some diversity initiatives, which I would approve of the initiatives in general, but the effect of them on the workload of the people that are having to enact them is another matter. There are also some things that women do because women are more likely to do some kind of task. And this is one of those situations where I want to hark back to my earlier slide about talking about diversity being awkward, in that sometimes you make generalizations about what women do, and actually some women don't, and that's fine. But generally, there are pastoral roles that women will take on that some guys will dodge. I overheard someone refer to me as the lab mum when I was doing a postdoc, because whenever anybody had any difficulty, they came and spoke to me about their difficulties because I was a mature student and in the lab. So I was the person that they saw as a friendly face to talk to. So here I am, I'm the lab mum. Haven't managed to have any children of my own, but hey, I've got a load of truculent postdocs. Lovely. But this is, nobody chose to the lab dad, right? Nobody decided to cry on the senior guy's shoulder. It was the other way around. And these things are just stuff that we do. They're just stuff that we get on with. But it does impact our ability to do other things like computing, which is, after all, what we're here for. I am technical. I would like to be doing more technical stuff. But obviously, I'm also interested in this. So that's the kind of why section. There are a bunch of things going on that make being in a minority in tech difficult. And now moving on to the call to arms section, which is this isn't a problem that women can fix on our own, right? We can't be responsible for fixing this, partly because I've been doing this for a long time, and we haven't shifted that 20%, right? 20% is still optimistic. So we need some help. So I've got some don'ts and I've got some do's, and that's where we're going with this second half, right? First don't is the important don't, the really important don't. Don't be that guy, yeah? I'm not going to talk about any of the many cases of sexual harassment at tech conferences and tech companies. I'm not going to talk about online harassment. I'm not going to ask people to put their hands up because it would just be embarrassing to ask the women to put their hands up about this. But just don't. Don't assume. Don't touch people. Just don't. Yeah, if you have ever tempted to send someone a photograph of your penis, don't. Not even somebody else's. Just don't. And this happens all the time, right? There's a reason I'm not on Twitter, and it's because I don't like dick pics. It's just horrible. Don't hold women and minorities to a higher standard, right? So this happens a lot in terms of the whole kind of, you're talking to two people, one's a man, one's a woman, you assume the guy's technical. There's a kind of assumption that women aren't technical, so you have to pull out your credentials all the time. And there's a kind of gatekeeping that goes on, particularly in tech spheres, where people have to prove that they know details of arcane things to show their expertise. And this gatekeeping happens both externally but also internally. So there's evidence that women will not apply for jobs or not go for things until they hit more of the criteria than guys. And this was famously, it was in Sheryl Sandberg's book, I think, Lean In, with some numbers that appear to not be quite as evidence-based as one might hope. But it does seem to be true that if you've got a lot of criteria for a job, women will go for the job, apply for the job if they hit all of the criteria, whereas guys are much more likely to fly a kite and go if they hit some of the criteria. Has anyone here been involved in shortlisting, dealing with job applications? Yeah? Okay. Have you ever waded through lots of CVs of people who probably didn't read the spec as carefully as you would like them to? I think that's everybody, yeah. Did you spot any gender differences in that? Were there more guys doing the kite flying? Yeah, there's some nodding. And there's different ways that we can try and counter this, right? One way you could try and counter this is not to be so specific when you're doing job ads. So if you've got job ads with fewer criteria, actually what you're looking for when you're looking for a job, when you're employing, is usually someone who's got the right attitude for the job and some of the skills, and you're probably going to engage in some training. If you've got a decent job, most jobs have some kind of training involved in them, right? So if you have the ability to be less specific and acknowledge that you're going to be doing training on the job, having someone who's got the right skills, but not perhaps every aspect that you want straight away, could be much better than getting an overconfident person who thinks they can hit boxes that they might not be able to hit. But generally speaking, women are often held to higher standards, and try not to do that. If men and women talk for equal amounts of time, so this is another place where the psychologists have done the studies. They record how often people are talking, and I think it's about 35%. So if women talk 35% of the time, they're perceived as talking half the time. So if women and women talk for equal amounts of time, people report that the women are talking too much, which is just weird. It's just weird. But you can measure it. This is a website where there's 2 buttons. Who's talking? Man, not man. And you can measure it, and it will tell you the percentage of time that people have been talking. And it's quite interesting to just have it running, with the telly's on, or in a meeting. Doing it in a meeting can be annoying to some of the men, but why not try it? Try to just monitoring how often you listen to men's voices and how often you listen to women's voices. I think you'll find you might be surprised how half the population isn't really getting quite so much of a look in. And don't talk over women. Don't do that thing where a woman starts to talk and a guy starts to talk over them. Don't do that thing where a woman suggests something and then a guy repeats it, which happens all the time. Once you start looking for it, it happens all the time. And don't pay women less. I mean, I probably shouldn't have to say this, but anyone here enjoy Pay Gap Bot on International Women's Day? So on International Women's Day, this bot dug up. I'm going to click on this link, and then we're going to see where it's going to open. It's going to open on this tab, obviously. Can I put it on that tab? It slides in from the side. So on International Women's Day, Pay Gap Bot detected, we'll go back, anyone tweeting on International Women's Day. Check out our latest, there we are. It seems to have done a whole big dump of alphabetical tweets since International Women's Day. But the idea on International Women's Day was every time an organisation would tweet their wonderful International Women's Day publicity, it would tweet back the gender pay gap, saying this is, as you can see, quite noticeable. And just don't. Because apart from, which window do I want? I want that one, good. Apart from anything else, if you find you're being paid less than a male colleague who started 3 months before you and has less experience, and you start talking to human resources about rectifying this anomaly, because it's only $3,000 a year, but integrate that up, that's quite a difference. And human resources tell you that it's nothing to do with gender. And so you start talking to the trades union, and then you start bringing in external people, and then 18 months in, they say, actually, there was a mistake here, have some back pay, but we're still not agreeing it was gender. It takes up a lot of your time, right? It takes up a lot of your time. I am talking from experience. Don't pay women less. It's really, really irritating. Now, do this, right? So hopefully by this point, if I haven't beaten you all into submission, or maybe if I have, you've realized that there's some things going on with gender, and particularly with minorities, that are kind of unpleasant for large parts of the time. And those women who are still in tech are quite good at shrugging it off, because we're still here, right? If we weren't quite good at shrugging it off, we'd have gone. Being an ally would be really useful. And there's lots of different ways you could do this. So the easy stuff, right? So amplify women's voices. If you see a woman being talked over, then say, hang on, was she speaking? Or if you see someone repeating what a woman said, so didn't so-and-so say that just now? It's easy to just amplify what people are saying. Does everyone know what a manel is? Yeah, it's an all-male panel. So there's a couple of pledges. So if you pledge not to appear on a manel, this means that if you as a man are invited to speak at a conference and all the other speakers are men, you say, I'm sorry, I'm not going to speak on an all-male lineup. And that means that you're turning down an opportunity to speak, but it also means that you are persuading the conference organisers to think twice about the lineup that they're dealing with. You can also pledge not to appear at an event without a code of conduct. I wouldn't go to an event without a code of conduct. I don't know if you would. Hands up if you go. Hands up if you wouldn't go to an event without a code of conduct. Good. Okay. Well, I'd like that to be more. I'd like as a gesture of solidarity. It'd be really nice if the people who are comfortable going to events without code of conduct were to say that they weren't comfortable, just so those of us who can't get more events we could go to. Encourage women and girls, right? So this is to do with the self-efficacy thing, which is a really big problem, because that's what I think one of the biggest feedback loop problems. So encourage women and girls to say you could do this, and that can happen with your kids. It could happen with your nieces and your any women and girls you come across. I don't mean like run up to them in the street and say, do computing, because that would be weird. But do try, if you're having conversations about like careers or future ideas or anything like that, try and be positive. Try and think that these are options for people. I remember seeing someone interact with my nephew when he was 18 months old. He was trying to get out of his pram, and he was working out how the thing worked as he was bolted into his pushchair. And the person looked at him and said, God, he's going to be a great engineer one day. And I'm like, he can't even speak. How are you suggesting engineering as a possible career path to a person who cannot even speak yet? How cool is that? But also, would you do that if it was a niece? I don't know. With regard to pay, guys in the room, please talk about your salary, because a lot of places are really, really coy about what they pay people. And it's easy for gender pay gaps to persist if everyone's secret about what they're getting, right? So if you talk about your salary, that's a really small thing you can do that can help women in your organizations. And learn about unconscious bias, right? So has anyone here done unconscious bias training? Okay. Was it good or was it terrible? Hands up if it was terrible. Hands up if it was good. Cool. Good. I've heard there's some good stuff. I've not done any. I mean, in my workplace, it was a video thing with questionnaire. It wasn't really very interactive or exciting. There's not a lot you can learn from a video with a questionnaire. I mean, there's quite a lot you can learn from a video with a questionnaire, but you really want something more interactive. I think of unconscious bias as being a little bit like health and safety at work. You're learning, if you're carrying a big ladder, don't turn around without checking there's no one behind you, kind of stuff. Unconscious bias is being aware of the damage that you can accidentally cause. And it's really useful to know this stuff. Recently, there's a new thing come out, which is the discrimination first aider, which is kind of like, if you think about unconscious bias as being, let me try not to accidentally hurt my colleagues. Discrimination first aid is, if my colleague gets hit on the back of the head with a ladder, I know what to do, kind of stuff, in the same kind of situation. And it's by a startup called Valor. I have a discount code for this, which I'll post on a Discord later. So this is first aid for people who are experiencing or have experienced discrimination. So it covers the legal framework, what evidence you need to create, curate, not create. You don't create evidence, you curate and collect evidence. What support you can give and that kind of stuff. And it's an online course, but it's quite intensive. So that's a way you can learn how to be useful in these situations. Do consider workload, right? So the workload associated with being in a minority is, I've mentioned it before, is the diversity tax. So mentoring, panels, speaking, pastoral care, and also actual extra work. So a place I know of recently asked all people traveling to do some extra training to make sure they were safe when they were traveling. And this extra training was 6 online courses, unless you're a woman, in which case there's an extra one on how not to get raped, because you can learn that from a video. And they refuse to let women travel unless they've done this extra course. And it's like, well, firstly, if you can learn that from a video, then I think we'd all know, and we'd all, it would have gone around the International Secret Network of Women. We would have shared that video. But secondly, what a waste of time, right? Why is there extra work associated with that? And this is ignoring the shadow workload that we really don't want to talk about. So if you're a manager, can you take this into account? Yeah? Could you not expect so much other work, perhaps? Or could you take on some of the workload? Could you pick up some of this diversity work? So I'm really pleased to see that the code of conduct here is Guy, literally a guy. Super. But make sure the events you organise are safe for minorities, and help organise events directly aimed at minority groups. Mentoring came up in yesterday's keynote, and I'm going to mention it again. Mentoring doesn't have to be technical. It doesn't have to be about specifically answering technical questions. It can be more general kind of workplace-based mentoring, and it doesn't have to be someone senior. So they're calling it reverse mentoring, where you have a mentoring relationship with someone who's not senior to you. And actually, it helps a lot. I have a question? There's a question from online. Yeah.
I'm really interested in psychology around gender differences. Do you know about the baby X experiments? If so, what is your opinion on them?
Which experiment, sorry?
The baby X experiments.
I don't know
and
those.
If so, would you have?
I don't know
opinion.
I don't know those, I'm afraid. Not something I'm familiar with, but I will I'll look it up and take that onto the Discord. So sponsoring is like mentoring, but it's kind of like mentoring, but isn't. Does everyone know what a sponsor is? It's generally in larger organizations. But the idea is a sponsor is someone that advocates on your behalf. So a mentor is someone who like has a hands-on giving you directions in your career. Sponsor is someone who says to other people, have you looked at them? They're great. So kind of creating opportunities, not like advising you what to do, but creating opportunities for you to move into. And also, don't leave women to be the pastoral staff. So don't like make it always that there's a lab mum. Consider the personal cost of activities. So events after work or at the weekend, obviously not accessible to those with caring responsibilities. This is not just women that have issues with this stuff. When it comes to class, there are problems if travel refunds always happen after the fact. If you've got caring responsibilities, travel in general can be problematic. And international travel, some countries can be really dangerous for some of our colleagues. And we need to think these things through. We need to be more aware of the difficulty of dealing with certain types of activity. And I'm not sure that videos on how to avoid getting into trouble are going to cut it. And considering sense of belonging, this idea that people don't feel as home in tech, one way to kind of counteract that, as women in tech at least, but also I'm guessing as Black in tech or LGBT in tech or neurodiversity groups, there are organizations that put on events, right? So as women in tech, I found it was literally transformative. Going to the Hopper actually changed my feeling about all sorts of stuff. And if you've got women staff, providing opportunities for them to do this, travel if needed, is really useful. You could help organize them. You could let them be hosted in your buildings. Those kinds of things could be really useful. But also consider homogenization, right? So some women in tech hate the women in tech stuff. Some women in tech just really want to get on with being a nerd. And I have a lot of sympathy for that opinion, even though I have just gone on at you about women in tech stuff for a long time. Apologies if you're one of those women who hates this. Sorry. But not every gay person wants to go to Pride. Not everyone observing Ramadan will be Asian. Not every Asian colleague will be observing Ramadan. I had a diversity leaflet for one of the organizations I was in, bounce back because the Asian woman on the leaflet wasn't wearing a headscarf. And we're like, she's Hindu. There's assumptions being made all the time about all sorts of things. And what I want you to do is to consider these assumptions. This kind of fostering self-efficacy, this point fits quite well, I think, with Guy's keynote from yesterday about confidence, building people up, mentoring, making people feel like they can do it, right? And this applies to minorities, but it also applies to junior staff across the way. Training programmers, growing programmers, works across all groups. Confidence is really, really easy to knock and hard to build. So if we could try and be excellent to each other and try and build up confidence, particularly for minorities, I think that's a really important thing to do. If someone isn't sure they can do something and you think that they're up for it, tell them. Be excellent to them. And we all belong here. We all are able to contribute. People should be able to bring their whole selves to work. Think about all of the different types of selves that we have and all the different things that we might need in order to be able to bring our whole selves to work. And let's try and build a community that is good for this kind of stuff. And that is close to the end of my talk, very close to the end of my talk. Bad for tech, the current situation. It's bad for minorities in tech. It's bad for majorities in tech. Women can't fix this on our own. We've been trying for a long time, and it's just not working. So I'm going to leave you with this quote from Rebecca George, OBE. So, profession that's better for women is good for all. You've got better business processes, you've got happier, diverse, productive workforce, you've got better conditions, you've got people able to be their whole selves at work. And also, women, we've been doing this for a long time and we haven't had much success. Maybe we're just rubbish at diversity. We need the massive brains of the male population to help us on this one. And there's a lot of you. You could like make a rota or something. Like Mondays Steve does it and Tuesdays the Daves get together or something like that. It's really good it would be useful to have some help. And that is the end of my talk. So I have the any questions slide or comments or disagreements.
When you were talking a little bit about travel and places that might be unsafe for LGBTQ people, also there are certain countries that are less safe for women than other countries. How do you square travel is also an opportunity. It's not just a chore. Yeah. I mean, I enjoy coming to, I come from the United States. I enjoy coming here for this conference. How do you work for that?
It's a very difficult question, how you square these things. I don't know. I know that there's parts of the world where I, as a woman, would not be comfortable. Parts of the world where women aren't allowed to drive cars, for example, or be out without a male accompanying them, and I wouldn't be happy to do that. I know there are parts of the United States now where my trans friends wouldn't be able to go to the bathroom, and that would really impair their ability to enjoy a conference, And I think we need to start considering this and thinking about where we host things, apart from anything else. And that's the decision we can make, right? That's the kind of pressure we could begin to put on situations, which isn't ideal, but it's a difficult problem.
Okay. Thank you for the talk. So I remember reading something a couple of years ago. I can't remember if it was a paper or an article, but they had this model for how people sometimes approach conversations, and your sort of discussion about men talking over women, it sort of reminded me of that. And it was that men who are often more guilty of that tend to view conversations as almost a way to kind of set a hierarchy or sort of dominate in some sense, and women more often approach them from a sort of bridge building perspective. And that kind of clash causes issues. And so my question for you is that something you feel is a helpful model or counterproductive?
I think understanding these gender differences is a really useful thing to do. And I think this harks back to the slide I had right at the beginning, where I talk about arguing from the general to the specific to the general, right? So we all know really confrontational women, and we all know really collaborative guys. And actually, there's a sense in which generalizations like that can be polarizing, because people either see them as absolutely true, that's how I am, or they see it as a value judgment. So being combative is a good thing and women should lean in and be more assertive, or they see being collaborative as being a good thing and men should change to be more collaborative. I think what we really need is for people to be aware that these differences exist and that actually certain groups are more likely to behave in certain ways. And if we're aware of these group traits, we can start to use the stereotypes as useful cognitive shortcuts, which help us to understand people more quickly and realize when they break down and realize when they no longer apply, rather than just applying them blandly. Does that begin to make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah, for this talk. I have just a short question on the app you said, counting the amount of time women and men speak in a meeting. So given that only 20% of the attendees are women, so is it is the goal that even then the amount of time is the same, or do you divide it by the number of women and men in the room?
I'd like to see generally statistics divided, normalized by the number of people participating.
So the goal and message is
so on average, women get to talk. The average woman gets to talk for the same amount of time as the average man. Not women as a group get to talk for.
Thank
I mean, obviously, the situations differ. I mean, this session, obviously, women have been talking a lot because I've said a lot.
Thank you. Sorry. Hannah, you touched on the ratios of participants in was it GCSE and A-level. So there kind of seems to be a collapsed participation. Do you have a chance to find out when this starts? When does the rot set in? I mean, I've got
when does the rot set in?
I've got 2 kids, one of each gender, by the way, and it's anecdotal, but you get opinions as to this starts.
So
I worry.
In terms of when do girls realise science isn't for them and boys realise science is for them, it's really early. My nephew Stanley had a 5th birthday party, which was a science-themed party, and he invited all of his friends, and one of the girls said she couldn't come because science was for boys. And this is obviously an anecdote, then the plural of anecdote is not data, but there is actually data backing this up, and there are studies backing this up, showing that kids are really good at spotting tribes, right? And the first 2 tribes they spot are gender, and the shops are full of future rocket scientist, future princess t-shirts. Kids spot it. Kids pick this up. So I would say a lot of the interventions that we're making are happening too late. I would say that anything targeting 14-year-olds is too late, surely. Yeah. By the time kids are making choices, their minds are already made up. We need to be in primary schools, and probably infants.
Thank you ever so much, Hannah. You mentioned relevance at the beginning. You also mentioned on the way through that thing about, you're a great role model. Do you think role models are actually what we need, or is it role projects, things that show that relevance about how you can change the world? Because we're a bit thin on role models. We bring out Ada Lovelace and Grace Hopper, and I'm going to talk about Margaret Hamilton briefly. Margaret Hamilton, briefly later on today. And I feel a bit bad about that because last century and beyond. But is it actually about the people, or is it about the things you can do? Is it role projects we want?
I think role projects are a really interesting idea, and I think showing the relevance of computing is absolutely what we need to be doing. I mean, everybody wants to have all kids of whatever gender they identify as want one of those pocket computers that we call telephones, right? Every kid wants a mobile phone as soon as they can. And actually doing things that enable them to program that are really, really useful. And understanding the applications that the way that computing is everywhere and can change the world and all of these things. But I also think there is some truth to the you can't see it. You can't be it if you can't see it. Obviously, we all have multiple intersecting identities, right? I'm a woman in computer science, I'm a nerd, I'm a Linux user, I'm a programmer, I'm all of these things. And I will choose role models that fit my identities as and when I see them. I'm not going to look for all of my role models to look exactly like me because there are not that many of them. And it's true, but seeing someone that you identify with doing something that you want to do is a way of fostering a sense of belonging in that discipline. Does that answer?
Hey, I remember a lightning talk. I can't remember if it was ACCU or another conference. Someone pointed out some interesting data where it turns out if you look at the raw data of women proportion in graduates in science and technology, the least favorable the condition the country are for women in diversity, the more you get. There is more proportional graduates, female scientists and technicians in say Turkey, Tunisia, or Saudi Arabia than there is in Sweden and Norway. And I wonder if there's been some research on that You got some explanation about it?
Yeah, there's been a lot of cross-cultural studies in diversity in tech and STEM more broadly. So there's a project called ROSE, Relevance of Science Education, which looks at kids' perceptions of STEM subjects across different countries. And it seems to be partly associated with economic development. So the countries, for example, places like Uganda, everybody wants to be a scientist, whether they're men or women. But like Norway and Sweden, as you say, fewer. And I think the whys about this, that how this happens and why this happens, is difficult to understand. Your point about countries where women have less freedom, women more often want to be in tech, is a kind of related thing. And there has been some study on attitudes suggesting that in certain cultures, tech is seen as a really good job for a woman because they don't have to leave the house. So it's suggested as a possible career, like promoted as a possible career. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. You mentioned about problems for people, say LGBT and travel and safety and things like that. You sometimes often hear as a retort to that well, LGBT people, whether it's trans or gay, they can hide their identity when they're traveling or when they're at work. And there's sort of that pressure exists at work for people to pass or to hide their identity, which is then self-reinforcing. So what would you say is a good argument to counter that?
So I'm not sure I heard all of that, but I think it was that with LGBT people you could conceal your identity to the extent that through hiding your identity there would be some kind of safety. And I think what we really have to consider is the idea of bringing your whole self to work and being comfortable to bring your whole self to work. And some people are intensely private and might not want to bring their whole self to work. And some people aren't intensely private and would like to bring their whole self to work. And I think being able to do both and have the freedom to do both is something we should be really striving for, in the same way that we should be striving for women in tech who want to do diversity stuff to do it, and women in tech who just want to get on with the tech to be able to just get on with the tech, you know? Does that answer?
One of the differences that I see, at least my intuition, is there is a difference in risk-taking. Women, in a way, are more afraid maybe of failure, which has an impact on career path. How can we encourage women to take more risks?
How can we encourage women to take more risks, or how could we encourage men to take fewer? I mean, one of the reasons that teams with diverse boards do better is that the companies take fewer risks. So in general, they perform better. And I think seeing masculine risk-taking behavior as something that women should lean into and perhaps try and emulate, it could be one of the problems. And we also have to consider the whys of this, yeah? So one of the reasons that women are risk averse is that the cost of failure is higher for women. Women are held to higher standards. So one of the ways you could encourage women to take more risks is to make risk-taking equally dangerous for men and women. If that were the case, perhaps we'd see behavior shifting. Does that answer?